Hello, everyone. Uh, I apologize for the delay in some of the more recent lectures. Like everything else, metaphysics in the time of the coronavirus is a bit chaotic. At any rate, uh, today I'd like to talk about the traditional problem of individuation. This is related to some of the earlier material concerning Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles, where we talked about the possibility of two individuals or two concrete things that exactly resemble one another, potentially having exactly the very same qualities. For example, two spheres which have exactly the same shape and size and weight, color, and so on and so forth. So they would exactly resemble one another, it appears, in every respect. Another kind of example seems to be two conscious minds that have exactly the same experiences and thoughts. At any rate, the problem of individuation concerns what factor would make two such entities distinct or diverse from one another. In other words, if you have two things, in virtue of what are those things different from one another? Classically, this has been understood as the problem of coming up with a meaningful principle of individuation. In medieval Latin, a principle of individuation was known as the Principium Individuationis. It provides a criterion by which we can differentiate one entity of a certain kind from another entity of that very same kind. So given that there are lots of kinds of entities, there can be different problems of individuation depending on which sort of entity or which kind of entity you're seeking a principle of individuation for. So the most general form of the problem would be, can you come up with a principle or criterion of individuation which applies to anything of any kind whatsoever? A slightly more circumscribed issue would be, what is the principle of individuation for concrete entities in general? Perhaps the version of the problem that receives most attention historically, though, and which I'm going to focus on primarily today, is what is the principle of individuation for concrete individual things or individual substances, things like spheres and tables and people and animals and plants and so on. Secondarily, we could also look at the question of what is the principle of individuation for entities of some other specified kind. Say, the principle of individuation for events or properties or places or what have you. Right, so looking at the problem then for concrete individual things like tables and people and objects and so forth. The problem can be posed by considering a case where you have, as I said, two objects which appear to exactly resemble each other. They resemble each other as much as we can imagine or conceive. They seem to be alike in every one of their qualities to start with. So intrinsically, they're just alike. So two spheres made of the same material, with the same, exactly the same physical qualities of size, shape, weight, color, etc., etc. And all of the parts of those spheres are exactly the same in a corresponding way. So the right half of one of the spheres is exactly like the left half. Of the sphere, and the right half of one of the spheres is exactly like the right half of the other, and the left half of each of the spheres are exactly the same, and so on. So, given these two exactly similar objects, the question is, what is it about them that makes them different from one another? What accounts for the difference or diversity of the two? What makes them two spheres rather than just one sphere? So one answer might be that there's a difference in properties between the two. But of course that isn't going to work if properties are limited just to the qualities of the two spheres, since by hypothesis the spheres have the very same qualities. Remember, Leibniz held that you couldn't have two exactly similar objects like this, that one would always have some difference from the other, like say this one would have a little crack in it that that one doesn't have. So the hypothesis though was that this one doesn't have the crack, that they're both the same. Now if they could be as similar as these two, one having the crack and the other not having the crack, it's intuitively plausible to think that that crack needn't have been there, and we still could have had the two things. So it's hard to make the case for the Leibnizian view that there's always going to be some difference, like a crack or a bump, that one object has that the other doesn't have. So if we can't say that they differ in some quality that they have, what's left? Well, we could say that they differ in some relation. For example, one of the spheres has a sphere to its east, and the other doesn't have that property. It has the property of having a sphere to its west, so there's a difference. But we see that, we saw that that won't ultimately be enough, because we could introduce more spheres. We could imagine a endless row of spheres evenly spaced, each of which is exactly like its neighbors. And then we wouldn't be able to say that one of them has a sphere, say, to its east, that the other doesn't have. All of the spheres in the endless row would have spheres both to their east and west. So that won't get us to a solution. So historically, the argument has been that there's some factor other than a property or a relation, at least as these are ordinarily understood, that differentiates these. So it looks like it can't be a quality of the spheres because qualitatively they exactly resemble. And bringing in relations doesn't help because we've seen that all of the spheres in the endless row of spheres have exactly the same relations as one another as well. So in terms of qualitative properties and relations, the spheres are indiscernible yet not identical. There are two of them. So what makes them two? That's the question. One answer historically that was given was that the spheres are made of different matter. So the principle of individuation, according to this claim, is that sphere number one over here is made of a certain batch of matter, and sphere 2 over here is made of a different batch of matter. So the difference of the spheres is accounted for in terms of the difference of their matter. Of course, this immediately prompts the embarrassing question, and what makes the matter of this sphere different than the matter of the other sphere? And there doesn't seem to be any answer to that. So that answer is not looking too convincing. What other answer could possibly be given? Well, another popular one is that the spheres occupy different places at one and the same time. So they have different spatiotemporal locations. This sphere has this spatiotemporal location, or it's located in this place at a certain time, and at the very same time, this sphere on the other side is located in a different place. So the idea is that we can explain the difference of the spheres in terms of the difference in their positions or locations. So what are we to make of this move? Well, I can see two issues. One is the question of whether there might be or could be individual substances that lack location. So if it's possible, even possible, to have individual substances with no location in space, then we cannot say that the principle of individuation for all individual substances consists in their location in different places at the same time. Could there be individual things, concrete individual things that lack location? This might seem to be a pretty exotic notion. Of course, one of the most important philosophers to argue that non-located individual things are indeed possible was Descartes. According to Descartes, it's at least possible, and in his opinion, actual, that there are non-located minds, or as they're often referred to, souls. So if if souls are possible and they lack any location, then we can't say that the principle of individuation for all possible individual things is being in a different spatial location, being in a unique spatial location that no other individual substance has at a given time. Descartes' argument for this, of course, was that it's conceivable that a mind be that a mind possess any number of mental qualities such as experiences and thoughts, even though that mind is uncertain of the existence of a physical body. So Descartes argued that he could rationally doubt the existence of his body and his bodily properties, even though he was at the same time entirely certain and assured of the existence of himself, together with all of his thoughts and experiences. And if that's conceivable, he argued, why wouldn't it at least be possible for such a soul or unembodied consciousness to exist? I mean, it may well be that for material substances, their essence or nature requires location, extension in space at a particular place. But why suppose that minds whose reality is assured or entailed by their possession of consciousness and thought and experiences, why assume that things like that need to be located in a particular place is hard to see. In other words, it appears that for material things, location in a place is required, but it doesn't seem to be the case that location is required for the reality of a mind. The reality of a mind is ensured by the reality of thought and consciousness. So, if individual things can be unlocated in the case of unembodied souls or minds who know of their reality and are certain of their reality because of the certainty that consciousness or thought is occurring, and these things have no particular location, then clearly location can't be the principle of individuation in general for all individual substances. And we could easily imagine two such souls which are exactly alike. They each have the same experiences, feelings, and thoughts. So one soul thinks, say, that he is happy, and the other soul also thinks that he is happy. And one soul thinks that he's experiencing a certain pleasurable sensation, and the other soul also thinks that he's experiencing that very same sort of pleasurable sensation, and so on and so forth, so that the two souls would be different. Each would have its own separate consciousness, but the quality of their thoughts and experiences would be exactly alike. So just like you could have bodily twins that exactly resemble each other in their bodily qualities, you could have psychological twins who exactly resemble one another in their psychological qualities. So if that's the case, then the spatiotemporal criterion of individuation won't hold up. So that's the first problem for the claim that what distinguishes one material object X from another material object Y is their difference in locations. It'll work for the material objects just fine, of course, but it'll fail in the more general case of what makes one individual substance different from a second individual substance, because some of those individual substances might be these souls that don't have any location. So it must be something else that makes them different from one another, and it's hard to see what that would be if it's not their matter or their qualities that differentiate them from one another. However, just looking at the case of material things, there's a second problem. Okay, so these things all definitely must have location. And of course, if you don't believe in the possibility of unembodied minds, like spirits or angels or human souls, then the impossibility of distinguishing them by a spatiotemporal criterion won't be a problem for you anyway, if you don't believe those things are even possible. There'll still be this problem, though. How we understand the notion of place or space. There are two main theories. One of the theories is the theory of absolute space. So according to the idea of absolute space, space is a container that exists independently of anything that exists or occurs within that container. So according to this theory of what space is, space exists independently of any spatial entities. It just exists absolutely, even if nothing else exists. This view has been very controversial and much disputed throughout the history of philosophy. Sir Isaac Newton, though, favored the notion that space and also time exist as absolute, independently existing containers of objects and events. Leibniz, on the other hand, is a famous historical figure in metaphysics who advocated for a contrary theory known as the theory of relational space. So we have these two different views, absolute space versus relational space. According to the theory of relational space, space has no reality unless there are entities which have extension, size, and other intrinsic geometrical attributes. So if you took away all things in space, then space could no longer exist on this view. Space depends on the existence of spatially interrelated entities which have intrinsic geometrical properties such as size or shape or extension, more generally speaking. So, it looks like adopting space as the criterion of individuation for individual substances not only requires rejecting the possibility of non-spatial souls, which seems perhaps unwarranted, it also requires adoption of an absolute theory of space. Why would that be? Well, if space itself depends on things that exist within space, like individual substances, then it seems like we'll be providing a circular criterion of individuation if we say that what individuates objects is what places they're in, that two objects that are exactly alike are different because they occupy different places, but then we turn around and say that places can't exist without objects, then we're committed to the proposition that these places are themselves individuated by their relationships to the objects. Because if you turn around and ask, well, then what makes place 1 different from place 2? If you hold the relational theory, you're going to have to say that place 1 bears a certain relation to some object, which place 2 doesn't bear to that object. And so on and so forth. So each object is going to be related to other objects, and our whole system of spatiotemporal coordinates is going to depend on the relationships of these objects to each other. So it doesn't seem like we can say that given a relational theory of space, that what individuates objects is their being in different places. We're then just sneaking in this unwarranted assumption that we could somehow individuate places from each other without already knowing which objects are different from which other objects, which we couldn't possibly do on a relational theory of space. Right, so to sum up, there are two major problems with the claim that what individuates any individual substance X from any other individual substance Y is that X and Y occupy different places. The first is there might be individual substances that don't occupy places, namely Cartesian minds or souls, which have no location. They're completely unextended and unlocated. Their reality just consists in their being conscious or having thoughts and or experiences. And the second problem is that for the spatiotemporal criterion to work, even in the case of an ontology that only includes material objects, we would have to assume an absolute theory of space, and an absolute theory of space is hotly contested, to say the least. There's fairly wide acceptance, both historically and contemporaneously, of the idea that space depends on the existence of objects, or at least other spatially extended entities of some sort. And on such a view, individuating objects in terms of places is going to raise the question of what individuates the places, and on the relational theory, what individuates the places is their relationship to the objects, since they can't even exist, these places, without those objects. So the criterion of individuation for material substances in terms of spatiotemporal location on a relational theory of space is clearly circular, and therefore not an acceptable account. It would be unacceptably or viciously circular to say that what makes the objects different is that each is in a different place than the other, and then turn around and say that what makes the places different from each other is that they're occupied by different objects or are at different distances, stand in different relations to various objects. Right, so if we rule out matter as the principle of individuation, and notice the possibility of unlocated souls also seems to be a problem for supposing that matter is a principle of individuation, since these souls are totally immaterial and have no matter. So if we rule out matter, and we also, we've ruled out their qualities being different, and we've ruled out their matter being different, and the claim that their places or locations are different is the principle of individuation. Runs into the two problems we've discussed. What does that leave us with if it's not the qualities or the matter or the location of individual things that makes them different? What is it that makes them different? Well, there's one last theory that we can bring forward here, and it's known as the theory of haixeity. Haixeity is a Latin term coined by the medieval philosopher Duns Scotus. Scotus hypothesized that since you can have two objects which exactly resemble each other, but there must be a principle of individuation which accounts for or explains the difference of the two objects, even though they have exactly the same qualities, that there must be some kind of property which is non-qualitative. So it's a property, but it's not a quality in the way in which most qualities are. What does that mean? Well, it's not a universal. So most qualities are shareable. For example, roundness. So each of the spheres has roundness. The two spheres share roundness. They might have the same weight and size and color. So weight, size, shape, color, all of these are universals in that they can be predicated or of many things or shared as qualities by many things. The haixeity, though, is not a shareable quality, so therefore it would be a non-qualitative property. So what would this non-qualitative property be? Well, Scotus says we can only express or signify can only signify these properties by bringing in names of the objects. So the hypseity, say, of Aristotle would be the property of being identical with Aristotle. And according to Scotus, every individual substance has its own hypseity of this sort. So this sphere has the property of being identical with this, and this sphere has the property of being identical with that. And those are different, non-shareable qualities. Only this sphere can have the property of being identical with this sphere, and only that sphere can have the property of being identical with that sphere. So these qualities, which Scotus calls a hypseity, translated from medieval Latin, hypseity means thisness. So he's saying that each individual substance has its own unique quality of being that or this individual substance, which is its thisness or hypseity. In the case of people, each person would have his own hypseity, like being identical with you or being identical with me, and so on. Those are not shareable qualities, but express your essential individuality. So Scotus says that these hypseities are individual essences. So each individual necessarily has the property of being identical with it, yet at the same time those qualities are that quality will be necessarily repugnant to any other possible individual that could ever exist. So you're necessarily you, but no other individual is even possible with you. So each individual object has a special individual essence or hypseity property, which can serve as its principle of individuation. So we can now say that this sphere is different than that sphere because they have different hypseities. These will be different properties that the two spheres have, but they won't be qualities because they're not shareable universally. So Scotus says. So these are the main classical answers that have been given, that matter is the principle of individuation, that location is the principle of individuation, that hypseity is the principle of individuation. Given that we're accepting the possibility of two objects that exactly resemble each other qualitatively, Leibniz's notion that qualities are the principle of individuation, or that relations are the principle of individuation, won't be an option. The only other major response is that there is no principle of individuation, that the difference between objects is ultimately a brute fact. A brute fact is a fact which cannot be explained and which indeed has no explanation whatsoever. So it might be held that difference in the case of individual substances is simply a brutal reality, a brute fact, something which can't be explained further. This view would be appealing if, in addition to accepting the critiques of matter, qualities, relations, places, and so forth, serving as the principle, one also believes that haixeities are inadequate to solving the problem. And there's certainly some suspicion whether it can be rebutted would be a further issue about whether haixeities are themselves viciously or unacceptably circular in this context, because one might well argue that the haixeity of an object depends on that object. And so one might think that one's begging the question or introducing a somewhat circular or meaningless criterion in saying that we distinguish objects by their haixeities. And that would lead, if you accept that kind of argument, you're going to be led to say that the difference between objects is just a brute fact, that numerical diversity of objects is an ultimate unexplainable reality. So that's a possible response to this as well. The numerical diversity of objects cannot be explained. Cannot be explained further. It's just an ultimate thing. It's a brute fact. If we do accept the haixeity theory, the question does arise about whether we have, or in what cases we have, any kind of cognitive access to properties of this sort. It seems like one can plausibly argue that we're not actually able to perceive or grasp these thisness properties of objects. Consider if we were able to grasp the thisness of some object and really understand that property, then it seems like by remembering that property, we'd be able to identify the object which possessed it whenever we encountered that object. And it's clear that we can't do that. It seems that whenever we try to identify an object, we have to do it based on its perceptual qualities. not based on a haixeity which we're able to perceive when we perceive that object. So, I mean, if you think that we can grasp the haixeity of some object, it would seem like you'd be able to do it when you're directly perceiving that object in optimal or ideal circumstances. So if you're looking at some object that's right before you and your perception is unclouded and conditions are good, you could point to the object and say, this object has got this property of being identical with this, it's got its thisness. And then if you say, left the room for a minute and came back and there was an exactly similar object sitting there, would you be able to say that it has the same thisness quality or not? It seems not, because if there were another exactly similar object in the area, you wouldn't be able to tell if they had been switched in that moment, few moments of time when you had left the room. So it seems pretty clear that we have to rely on similarity in quality, not in haixeity, in order to re-identify objects from one time to another. So it seems that we don't actually ever know or comprehend or grasp these haixeity qualities. They'd be kind of theoretical entities that might be hypothesized or posited in order to provide a principle of individuation, but they wouldn't be qualities that we're actually acquainted with or familiar with in our everyday perceptual experiences of things. To put it another way, if we were acquainted with these haixeity properties from our perceptual experiences of objects, then we'd be able to, it seems, re-identify these objects over time by means of deductive inferences, valid deductive inferences from facts that we knew through direct observation of those things. We'd be able to say that the thing that was in front of me a few moments ago had this quality of thisness, and the thing that's in front of me a few minutes later has the same quality of thisness. And since the thisness can't be had by anything except one and only one possible object, it would logically follow that the thing that was in front of me earlier is identical with the thing that's in front of me now. And that would be a purely deductive inference. Contrast that with the inductive inferences that we have to typically use. Well, I would say in all cases have to use to re-identify any object in our environment which we perceive through our senses. We'd say that the thing that's in front of me at this time has this set of shareable perceptual qualities: color, shape, size, and weight, and so on. And then if I encounter an object a few minutes later that has exactly those same shareable perceptual qualities, I make the inductive inference that probably the object I saw earlier is the same object as the object I'm seeing now, based on their resemblance, but it's inductive because the object I'm perceiving might turn out not to be the same object as the object I perceived earlier, but merely some highly similar object or some duplicate object sharing all the same perceptual universals. And as we've seen in cases where there are actually two highly similar objects both circulating in the vicinity, you won't be able to know whether you're seeing the same object or not. You'll be relying on the similarity, but the similarity of the two objects throws into doubt the question of whether you've got the same object in front of you. As you had earlier, it might be the other one that's now in front of you, since you haven't had the objects under continuous observation all the way through. And even if you did continuously observe them, it would still be possible for them to be switched out really quickly through sleight of hand so that you never noticed that they were switched. So it's clear that the inference that we make when we identify an object seen earlier as the same object as an object perceived later is inductive, based on non-entailing knowledge that we have, basically that the objects are perceptually highly similar. The inferences are defeatable when there are duplicates or highly similar to the senses. Objects that are highly similar to the senses are in the area. Then we're thrown into uncertainty because we're relying on the similarity and shareable qualities, which does not entail identity. So it seems that we're never in a position to observe or attain acquaintance with one of these thisness qualities of any external object. All right. Does that mean, though, that we could never be acquainted with haixeity of any individual substance whatsoever? Well, that would appear to be a conclusion that's too hasty. Even though it appears that we can't grasp the haixeity of any physical object or person other than ourselves, the case of the self, of oneself, appears to fall into a separate category here. If you consider the question of re-identifying yourself over time, it seems like the sorts of arguments deployed against our ability to grasp or apprehend the haixeity of an external object fail. It doesn't seem like we need to rely on any observed qualitative similarities in order to identify ourselves from day to day. Remember the case of the unfortunate character in Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis who woke up one morning horrified to discover that he'd been transformed into a bug. He still knew that he was the same person, that yesterday he had the body of a man, and that today that very same person has the body of a bug. He'd be able to know this, though, even though his bodily shareable qualities had completely transformed and bore no similarity to his earlier bodily qualities. And his internal thoughts could be very different, too. After all, what you think of when you're in the body of a human and what you might be thinking of when you're in the body of a bug might be totally different as well. Yet he would have a very well-justified belief, nonetheless, that he's the same individual thing that had a human body the day before and now has a bug body today. What that suggests is that we as individuals do not need to rely on any inductive justification based on observed similarities in mental or physical qualities in order to re-identify ourselves from one time to another. So it might well be that what we're relying on to re-identify ourselves is apprehension of our axiety, our meanness or thisness, which we observe to be present at the two times, thereby enabling us to identify the self experienced at the earlier time as the same self that we experience later, because both selves have this very same quality of being me, my axiety. So on that note, I'm going to put this lecture to a halt. Remember that we have a second essay exam opening up on March 24th. So be sure to start working on that as soon as you can. I'll be turning next to hopefully getting feedback back to you before then on your work handed in earlier. Okay, so I'm going to sign off now, and to all of you, be safe, be well in this chaotic time, and I'll see you in a couple of days.